Welcome to BizShift, the show where we talk to business leaders from around the globe about the transformations and trends reshaping their industries. We're talking about what they're doing to put their organizations at the front of these structural shifts changing the global economy, like AI and infrastructure, the transition to a low-carbon economy, and more. Let's talk about new technologies.
The energy transition, I think, is something which will happen. It is happening.
Joining us for our first inaugural episode of BizShift is Miguel Stilwell, the CEO of EDP. EDP is a global energy company based in Portugal. And under Miguel's leadership, he's turned EDP into a leader in low-carbon energy, floating solar, wind, hydrogen, ocean carbon capture, and more. Welcome, Miguel.
Thank you, Mark. It's great to be here.
Miguel, let's start with the basics. Who and what is EDP?
So EDP is a global energy company. We operate in Europe, North America, South America, and Asia Pacific. And we're very focused on leading the energy transition. So essentially investing in renewables, investing in networks, investing in client solutions, basically anything that will help decarbonize the power sector all along the value chain from generation, distribution, and supply to customers. We invest about 25 billion euros over 4 years along this value chain. Around 40% of this goes into the US, around 40% into Europe, 15% South America, and 5% Asia Pacific. So more than 85% of our generation mix is already renewables. That's up from 20% about 20 years ago. So we've really done this big shift in terms of the energy transition. We'll be coal-free by 2025. We'll be all green by 2030. And we'll be net zero by 2040. So these are some of the commitments. And actually, we're very close to a lot of these key objectives.
Talk about why the energy transition matters to you from a shareholder perspective.
So the energy transition, I think, is something which will happen. It is happening. And so as a company, we see that as a great opportunity to really grow, to take advantage of the disruption that's happening in the sector. I mean, this used to be a relatively boring sector, the utility space, many years ago. I think that's certainly changed over the last couple of years with the disruption in terms of the renewables, in terms of smart grids, in terms of all of the liberalization on the client side. So as a company, in terms of, when we think about shareholder value, we think about, being able to lead this transition, being able to capture that value for shareholders.
Let's just go to the microeconomics of electricity production. Why are wind and solar cheaper? Where are they cheaper than hydrocarbon-based alternatives?
To give you just a couple of data points, I mean, solar maybe 10, 15 years ago would cost maybe 400 euros per megawatt hour. At the moment, you can produce energy from solar panels at around 20 to 30 euros per megawatt hour. So you're talking about less than 10% of the cost that it used to be 10 or 15 years ago. That's pretty much the same also for wind. So really, you've had these massive economies of scale on the renewable side, which has brought down the cost of this. And then the resource itself is free. So essentially what you have is the capital cost up front. And then over time, you just need to maintain the solar panels and the turbines.
At what point, given existing technologies, do renewables reach a limit in terms of reliability and security for an energy system as a whole?
Well, I'll give you an example. Portugal already has a relatively high penetration of renewables. So on average, we had about 70% of our energy last year was produced using renewables. But we had a couple of days, we had about 6 days, consecutive days, 24 hours a day, where it was 100% renewable. So technically, you can produce all of your energy using renewable sources. Now, obviously, it is intermittent. And so you need to have some backup capacity, whether it's some thermal or storage. Obviously, a lot of the thinking in terms of what the future energy system could look like involves having renewables and storage. Because in some cases, you may be producing too much wind and solar, so you can store it. And other times, maybe you don't have enough, and then you can use that energy that's stored. So essentially, we're moving towards that system. In this transition period, the thinking is that you'll have the renewables with some backup, let's say, thermal. But I think one of the things I'd like to highlight is that every megawatt hour that you produce of renewables is 1 megawatt hour less of thermal that you need to burn. So it's one less megawatt hour of coal or gas that you need to import. So the US, for example, is energy independent, so maybe it's less of an issue for the US in terms of fossil fuels. But for example, Europe, we import most of our energy. And so every megawatt hour of renewables that Europe can produce means we are importing less from, for example, Russia. You know, we had this massive crisis, energy crisis, over the last 2 years because of Russia shutting off the gas into Europe. So for example, if we had more renewables, we would be less reliant on third countries for that.
So we've got all these renewables, we've got storage facilities, batteries, and other pump storage you're building and using. What do we have to do to make all of these various uses and sources of electricity interconnect in a reliable way? In other words, what do we need to do about the grid in Portugal, across Iberia, across Europe, across the world?
So the networks are an incredibly important part of the energy transition, because we talk a lot about renewables, but they need to connect to the network so that they can get that power can actually get into the customers' homes. It's often been a neglected part of the energy transition. It's certainly an area that requires a lot of investment. One of the most fascinating things about the networks is the capacity to make them smarter. Many networks around the world are still relatively blind in the sense that the network operators don't actually know if the consumers have energy. If there's a problem on the network, many times they don't know that. And so by automating digitalization of the network and by actually bringing more intelligence and sort of all the data to sort of the management of that network, you can actually make it much more efficient and provide a much better quality of service.
Let's talk about the role of governments in supporting the transition. An industry leader of great renown said that the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act is, quote, one of the most consequential pieces of legislation ever. Why did you say that?
Because it's true. I said it was one of the most consequential pieces of legislation because it was a very well-designed package to promote not just renewables, but let's say to ensure that the whole ecosystem around renewables, electric mobility, green hydrogen, all of that was given a boost. And one of the fascinating, or one of the best things I think about the Inflation Reduction Act is it gives you also this visibility and predictability over the next 10 years. As you know, we've been invested in the US since 2007, and we've been working with the production tax credits and the investment tax credits for the last 15, 16 years. Over this period, we were very dependent. It was very much a start and stop industry because these tax credits were dependent on approvals in Congress and in Senate and sort of getting it over the finish line almost on a yearly basis. And so there wasn't a lot of visibility or predictability that this would actually sort of carry on over time. I think the other thing is that it's an incredibly effective mechanism because it's these tax credits, you can monetize, you can sell them to third parties. And so we don't have a sufficient tax base in the US to take advantage of all of the investments that we do there. So we bring in partners and we sell these to our partners. But compared, for example, to some of the European mechanisms, it's a much more effective mechanism.
Like Europe, the US has a problem in execution, and that's permitting. Why is permitting? Seems like a minor problem, Miguel. What's the big deal with permitting?
So permitting is what allows us to actually build the projects. And as you know, these are all large infrastructure projects, whether you're talking about renewables or networks. And these require permits, environmental permits, building permits. And one of the big issues is the amount of time that it takes you to get these permits. And so in Europe, in many cases, it can take you 4 or 5 years, as much as 9 years in some cases. In the US, depending on some places, it can also be quite cumbersome. And so that ends up slowing you down because you can have good projects which are held up by, let's say, this bureaucracy, by this administrative burden in terms of actually getting the projects approved or not. Sometimes maybe all you want is an answer. Maybe the answer is no, but at least that allows you to kill the project and move on to new ones.
What's an example of a place you've seen tackle permitting effectively? What are you seeing that works?
I think some countries do it better than others, and they'll have some parts that are better than others. So once we had the war in Ukraine, Europe realized it needed to accelerate the permitting or reduce the sort of the permitting time. So it set a maximum time of around 2 years, and it said you had to do things like have a one-stop shop. You had to standardize the permitting processes. You had to digitalize them. You had to allocate more resources to the different administrative bodies that were approving these projects. So they came out with all of these great rules and recommendations that unfortunately haven't been completely transposed to the member state level. So our big effort at the moment is not at the European level, it's at the member state and sometimes even at the local level to just get the resources, do this digitalization and the standardization of these processes so that things can actually move forward faster.
Let's talk about new technologies. Which are the technologies that you think are most promising over the next 10 to 15 years? And which ones do you think are lovely to discuss, but you wouldn't put any money in?
So new technologies. First, I think we have some existing technologies which need to be scaled up. So we talked about wind, we talked about solar. But even within wind, there's onshore and offshore. But in terms of new technologies as well, obviously batteries and storage is an incredibly important part of the energy transition to solve that intermittency issue of the renewables. I think things like floating wind offshore, it's an interesting technology as well. In many countries, they have an ocean that they can use, obviously, to produce wind energy. In some cases, it's very deep, and so you can't have the typical bottom fixed offshore. And so places like California, Iberia, Japan, places off South Korea, you need to have these floating offshore wind technologies. So we've actually piloted a project here in Portugal, but also up in Scotland, of a floating wind technology. It's actually worked very well. It's ridden out several winters, including with 20-meter waves. And I think that's a technology which will be able to be scaled up over time. I think things like floating solar as well, using, for example, things like dams and using even sort of coastal areas perhaps that are more protected. Hybridization, it's not a technology in itself, but it's just combining the multiple different technologies into a single project and interconnecting that to the network.
Like solar and wind in the same place.
Like solar and winds, or solar, wind, and hydro, or batteries. These different technologies, you bring them all together, and you end up with a more balanced load profile for the network and for the consumers. Because one of the things is, for example, if you look at just solar, it's obviously just producing when there's sun, but maybe wind will be producing at night. If you put the two together, you end up with a more balanced, let's say, a better profile. And you can use the existing capacity, you can use the existing infrastructure much more efficiently than you would otherwise. So, different technologies are coming along all the time, but I think certainly these are some of the more interesting ones. Green hydrogen, there's a lot of talk about that. I think there's been quite a lot of hype about it. I think it'll settle down. I think it'll have its let's say, space as well. That's also something we're looking at. Let's see how it scales up over time.
Your goal is to put 21 billion euros to work through 2026. What has to happen for that to be fulfilled?
So we're investing 21 billion euros, as I say, in the different markets. So for that to work, we need to make sure that we have the permitting and the licensing to get all the projects approved. I think we have that. So we are dealing with that. We need to have the supply chain. Again, that seems to be normalized now, but over the last 2 years, there have been serious disruptions to the supply chain. Cost of capital. These are very large infrastructure projects, very capital intensive. So cost of capital needs to be, again, normalized. And obviously, the lower it is, the easier it is to deploy that capital and to earn a good return on that. And then, to be frank, we also need to have good people and good teams in all the different geographies. And I think that's one of the key things. And this is sucking a lot of people into the sector, which is great. And we just need to continue to do that to really be able to continue to drive this growth going forward.
You talked about a key dependency is that you need to have the people to fulfill your vision of investing $21 billion through the next couple of years. What are you doing to bring them along to actually build the team that you need to execute your vision?
So one of the things I love about this sector is, this used to be a boring sector. I mean, utilities in general, it wasn't a very stable, predictable earnings and dividends, and that was what really investors looked at. But there's so much going on now with the energy transition and with all the disruption that's taking place that it's become a very exciting sector. And in the sector with the purpose. I think one of the most fascinating, certainly one of the things that motivates me most, and I think most of the team, is to feel that you are having an impact. You are actually being a part of a massive change in the energy sector, which is at the core of the whole economy. And I think people want to be a part of that. And fortunately, we've been able to attract great people, retain great people, and quite frankly, I think we have a fantastic team.
So the last 25 years taught you that a lot of change came to what seemed like a boring industry. Looking out 25 years to 2049, when you probably won't still be in this job, what do you think are the biggest questions or uncertainties about that future world? Things that you'd love to know now about 2049?
The first thing is to embrace the change, because that will happen. I don't know exactly what will happen over the next 25 years, but I'm sure it'll be a lot of change, whether it's on the technology side, on the regulatory side. I would say on the geopolitical side, that's become a big part of the energy sector as well. So, if I think forward, it's just really keeping an eye out for what are the things that are going to disrupt the industry again, on the new technologies, or whether it's on, the configuration, the regulation, the geopolitics, what's going to change that is going to impact the sector. But I have a very optimistic view about the sector, certainly in terms of the utilities. As I said, I see a lot of growth there, not just in demand, but in terms of the technologies and in sort of just the potential for creating value here. So 25 years from now, I think utilities will be dominant in the energy space. I think the economy will be power-based, electricity-based, and I'm sure there will be a lot of things to do, but basically energy is something that is absolutely core to everything that we do. So, having cheap, reliable, affordable energy is always going to be critical for the economy and for the world as we know it.
Miguel, it's been a great conversation. Thank you very much for joining us here at BlackRock.
Thank you, Mark. It was a pleasure to be here.